I have been a person that believes that education should change radically. And every time that I ever heard somebody talk about how differently they wanted to change education, it was usually they would take the classroom experience and try and pluck it up and drop it online. And it seemed like nonsense to me. And then I ran into your podcast or whatever it is that you do on Twitter. And I found myself spending probably 2 or 3 hours listening to the way that you interacted with the other person that you do this podcast with, and the way you think about education, I think actually has the potential to revolutionize the future. And so I was so delighted when you said you were willing to come on that I don't even know where to begin. How do you begin to explain to people this way you think about online education?
Well, I'm flattered. Thank you, Vance. Maybe I can walk you through, how I got to this point, and how I started sharing all this, and what I've kind of like encountered along the way. So like I was saying, I had a typical learning experience growing up. So I was born in Panama, but my dad worked at a multinational corporation. So we moved around a lot. So, I was born here, but then we moved to Colombia, then Venezuela, India, Mexico, Brazil. And then I came back to Panama when I was 15. And by the time I was 15, I had attended 10 different schools in, 7 different countries. So I kind of saw how schooling looked in different places and different continents and, around the world. And it was pretty much the same. And obviously I didn't realize this when I was growing up, but now, as I decided to become an educator, I was really passionate about working with kids. I started reflecting on my own experience as a learner. And I realized that, it didn't matter where I was and how different the culture was and the people and everything. Schooling was pretty much the same. And when I decided to study education, I kind of wanted to do things differently. And I went to NYU. I studied childhood education and special education. I did a year of student teaching there. And then I moved to Boston. I taught for a year there in 1st and 3rd grade while my husband did his MBA. And then we moved back to Panama. And that was about 5 years ago. And then I taught for 5 years here in a big American school. And I taught 3rd and 4th grade. And that's when I started to really realize that the way that we've been doing things and what I experienced as a kid in all these different schools, it hasn't changed much, and it really hasn't changed in the past 120 years. So I started exploring that and, like where did this whole structure came from? And the moment you start reading the history about education, you start to realize, okay, this is so outdated. This no longer makes sense. No wonder kids are not really learning. Because it doesn't really matter what you try to do in school, how good of a teacher you are. As long as you're within this structure, there's very little learning happening. There's very little retention in part of the students. So I couldn't help but notice this over and over again. And it didn't matter what I did and how much I tried to make it fun and relevant. They were not retaining the information. So it finally got to a point last year when I was like, okay, I no longer want to teach within this structure and my inability to transcend the system. I want to go out and I still want to be an educator. I still want to teach, but I want to find better ways to do it. And of course, there's so many pedagogies out there that I resonate with and I think that are doing things, right. And, you have all the Montessori schools and the Waldorf and the Reggio Emilia and like all these approaches that really put the kid in the center. So I don't think that there's one approach that works. I feel like there are different approaches that work for different kids. And I just want to kind of like explore a different one and try out, different experiments to see what works. And when I left schools last year, sorry, you wanted to
No,
something?
go ahead. This is great. You're okay. On fire. Yeah.
I'm just kind of like walking you through to explain like how I got here. When I left last year, I kind of wanted to see how I could reach more kids. And to be honest, I wasn't really into the whole online learning idea. And the reason why is because like many people, I thought it was a very like passive process. And I thought that, what about the social interactions, which are so crucial in, when you are helping a kid learn. So I really wasn't really into it. But then I took this course with David Perel, who's now, my business partner. And he taught writing online. So it was like an online course. And I thought that I was just going to go in there and learn how to write. And for me, this was really interesting because I wanted to start putting my thoughts out there. And then it turns out that really what it did was it helped me become what he calls a citizen of the internet. And that's when it started opening my eyes to all the things that you could do in this live online environment. And you said something really relevant at the beginning, which is online education is really not grabbing or like trying to recreate schools in the online space. That is remote learning. And that is what we are seeing right now with the pandemic. And, since teachers have to like quickly migrate to the internet, they're trying to recreate schools online. And that's not online learning. That doesn't work. That is just trying to do what we've been trying to do for the past 120 years in schools, but online. And it wasn't working in the brick and mortar schools. Of course, it's not going to work online. Like, kids are not going to pay attention to a screen for hours. They are not going to be engaged to submit assignments. They're not going to be engaged to interact via, like these forums. Like, that is just not online learning. That's remote learning. So when I saw this other course, the rite of passage course that I'm telling you that I took, it was completely different. Like, it was very dynamic. Like, we did most of the things. Like, the instructor, who was David, was just kind of like imparting a little bit of knowledge, and then we all had to interact with each other, share our experiences, produce, and get feedback. And I was like, wow, if we're able to flip the model so that it works this way, where kids join an online space that is very lively, and what they do is actually collaborate and talk about the things that they're learning, in their off time, and then use that time to actually build things and get feedback, then that model does work. And it just, makes things faster. And we waste a lot of time in school, a lot of time that, kids are really not learning for the 7 hours that they're there. So I loved how with online education, when done right, it really reduces that downtime and all that wasted time that we have in schools, so that kids are in front of a computer for an hour and a half, and then that's it. And then the rest of the day, they're learning in different ways. So I was really drawn to this model, and I wanted to explore it more. And again, I don't think it works for absolutely everyone, but I do feel like it's a more promising approach than traditional education. And you can mix it with other kinds of like homeschooling and micro schools and other approaches. So that's what I really liked about it. And that's how I kind of like started to get into it.
I have become fascinated by the education system, and in my world, so I spend a lot of time with farmers all over the United States, and I've gone to places where they've been like, hey, we just don't want to send our kids to school anymore. We live in the farmer environment. We want them to be able to work on the farm and spend time with us. But when we send them into school, it's just not working out for us. But they didn't have some other option. And if you looked at online classes or the direction of homeschool, it was fitting this pattern that you were describing before of being the old model. What is this old model? How do you describe it, and where did it come from? Because education to me seems like it's the same that it was 20 years ago, and I hear that it's the same that it was 100 years ago, but I don't know what that means.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm going to kind of like concise it, like the history in like probably like a minute. So I'm going to miss out a lot of things, but the general idea was that, way back in like in the 18th century, they needed to train younger generations for the military, because there were all these wars between the nations, and they needed assembly line workers for the factories. It was the Industrial Revolution. So in this place called in Prussia, which is now part of Russia, they created for the first time these centers where they would bring kids in, and they would organize them by age. They would put them in a little environment with one like instructor leader, which was like the teacher, and they would teach the same thing, so that they would come out knowing how to follow instructions, how to do things the same way, and then they would be able to transition into the military or into factories. That model proved to work for that specific purpose. So other countries around the world and in the US, they started to say, hey, look at that model, let's go ahead and copy that. So they went to Prussia, they got trained in this model, and then that's how it started, to spread around the world, this idea of, unified schooling and compulsory schooling. So I'm just concising everything.
This is great. I didn't know any of this.
Okay. So then that's kind of how it started. And then, but if you think about it, before that, there was obviously a lot of learning going on, but it was very open-ended. And if you go back to like, the schools of Plato, I don't know if you say that, that's how you say it in English. Plato, yeah. Okay. I'm trying to translate. They were like open environments where people were learning through conversations, through, like thinking and working in different, like it was very open-ended. Or back when, in the farms, people would learn through, making and watching their parents, or they would learn through stories. So there was a lot of learning, and it was a lot more aligned to the natural way that we learn, right? Then when all this happened, that we needed assembly line workers in military and kids in the military, it became compulsory and it became mandatory, and very, kids had to follow instructions and this and that. And again, it worked back then, but then think about it, time went by, and we're here. And if you look back how many industries have changed in the past 120 years? Most of the industries have changed because, we're constantly changing in this world. And education is one that has not changed. And of course, they've added different things to make it more progressive, or they've added technology and this and that. But the idea is the same. We still have kids inside a setting for 12 years, for 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, learning with peers their same age, learning the same topics at the same time, at the same pace, and then being tested at the end so that they can enter university for another 4 years or so. So this model no longer works, right? Like back then, we needed assembly line workers and rule followers and people who knew how to follow instructions. Now we need creative thinkers, and we need kids who are able to, come up with things and solve problems, and who want to keep learning and not necessarily follow instructions. But the problem is that the system is still preparing them for a time that no longer exists and for jobs that no longer exist. And this is really concerning. And yet we continue to do it this way. And to be honest, unfortunately, I don't think that we're going to get rid of traditional schools anytime soon. I do think, especially now with this pandemic, that more and more, alternative approaches are going to rise, and parents are going to be more aware of these things and hopefully start to, make some adjustments. But the schools as such, I don't think we're going to get rid of them, especially, for lower, lower economic classes that they cannot afford all these alternative approaches. So that's kind of where it comes from and why it's not working.
Thanks for checking out this podcast short. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and becoming a tangibly better communicator, check out some of the classes that I've started to put online. Before coronavirus, I was traveling around the world teaching hundreds, sometimes thousands of people how to become tangibly better communicators. But now I've decided to take what I was teaching to large groups of people and put it online so that individuals that decided they wanted to make a change in their circumstance could do so by just buying a class for themselves. This class, Telepresence Professional Basics, teaches how you can use the microphones and the video cameras that you have, but turn them into something that makes you look and sound great. Many people in this new environment don't know how to sound professional, and so they just use whatever's there. With these tips and tricks, you can figure out, where should I put my camera? How can I utilize light to make the camera look the best? And how should I think about sound and improving it, so that way every time I speak during a meeting, people can hear exactly what I'm thinking, and it's pleasant to hear my voice. These tips and the ways that you can think about how to prioritize getting better are all included in the Telepresence Professional Basics course. If you're interested, you can go to store.articulate.ventures or just check out the link below.